All right, ladies and gents, so we're going to start talking about the heart, and just the irony was listening to heart. So you kids that don't know heart, you need to get educated. All right, anyway, so today we're going to talk about the structures of the heart, just major features of it, and then we're going to discuss blood flow. So to begin, with the heart, it is, again, this four-chambered thing that's sitting in the center of your chest, and it's composed of various structures like anything else in anatomy, and we're just going to go over and highlight some of the major things. You'll see more of this when you do your heart dissection. So the heart itself, it's a four-chambered organism, so because we are mammals, we have this characteristic that sets us apart from reptiles and then fish that have three-chambered hearts and two-chambered hearts. We mammals, we have four-chambered hearts, just like birds and just like crocodiles, actually. And with our heart, the way we set it up is that we have to talk about the right and left halves of it. So if we draw our heart, essentially what's going to happen here, we got the right side of our heart and the left side. And in our heart, we've got our four separate chambers that we separate via these structures called septum, and our valves that divide it into four parts. So you've got your right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. And with each of these parts, they do something in connection to how the blood flows through the whole of the organism. So for the right atria, its main job is to collect blood flow from the systemic circuit. So the systemic circuit, and then we have the pulmonary circuit. Essentially, the systemic circuit, if we think about our heart as this blob right here, right, and then we've got our lungs on each side. The systemic circuit is everything that's coming from the heart around back to the heart, and the pulmonary circuit is going from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. Okay. So the right atrium, its job is to collect all the blood from outside coming to the heart. It gets pumped from the right atrium to the right ventricle, which starts the pulmonary circuit. So it's sending blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, goes to the lungs, comes back to the left atria. So again, atria, these are entryways into the heart. The atria collects their blood from the pulmonary circuit, and then it gets pumped to the left ventricle and then out to the rest of the body. Okay. So with the anatomy of the heart, the way we kind of orient ourselves if we look at these pictures here is that with the heart, you can think about it this way when you're coming to orientation. So the veins and arteries are at the base. So the base is this top part of the heart, the widest part here, and the pointed part is down here. This is the apex. Okay, and like I mentioned before, your apex is going to point to the left side of your body. So it's going to be, if this is my chest here, or my heart here in the center, the apex is pointing down this way. Okay, and what's going to happen with your heart is it's actually sitting between two cavities. So we've got our pleural cavities. Pleural just refers to lungs. So your lungs are in these sacs called the pleura, and these cavities, and in these different in these sacs, and then between them you've got this cavity that's called the mediastinum, and this is where your heart is sitting. So it's like medial, so medial, and then stinum refers to the sternum, so it's like below in the middle part of the sternum. And what happens with your heart is actually sitting in this sac. So your heart is not unprotected, right? It's got this layer of connective tissue around it to protect it. It's thick and fibrous, and it's there to help stabilize the heart, to keep your heart from wobbling back and forth as you're moving. And the way that we think about how the pericardium is centered around the heart is that if we think of our heart as a fist, the pericardium is essentially wrapping around it like this. So it's like punching a balloon almost, if you think about it that way, is that this balloon of tissue is sounding around there, and you've got two different layers on each side. So when you squish the balloon in, you got the side that you're punching and then the side that's on the other hand here, and that is coming together. Right? So let's look at some surface anatomy of the heart. So you're going to look at this again when you do your heart dissections. So surface anatomy, let's just label some things. We got the right atria, right ventricle, and left atria. Which is behind here. And you can see these structures here. Do you see these that say auricle? Auricle. So auricle, it's like if you think about sound, oral skills, so your ability to understand and differentiate various pitches and sounds. These auricles like this, that just refers to like your ear. So the auricles of your heart are referring to the left and right atria, so these projections on here. So these actually expand when your atria fills with blood and then contracts to pump it into the next ventricle. Okay. There's other features on the outside of your heart that I want you guys to know. So you should be able to identify each of the different arteries. So your left pulmonary artery, your right pulmonary artery, which comes off on the right side over here. You've got your pulmonary trunk, and that just refers to where the blood is leaving out of your ventricle to either side. On the outside of our heart, you're going to see these different sulci. So you see this sulcus here. Again, a sulcus is like a divot. If you think about it this way, like you got blood on this side, sulcus in the heart, and in here are where your blood vessels are going to be. So your vessels here are coming from the sulcus, and then you have your coronary vessels or arteries and veins on top of the heart that wrap around it. So you have this anterior intraventricular sulcus, you have the coronary sulcus, so you'll be able to identify those on your heart. You'll also see a lot of fat on the outside of the heart. Part of that is for insulation. Part of it is that if you're unhealthy or out of shape, you'll actually develop more fat around the heart. It serves as padding, serves as insulation, has a lot of different reasons for it being there. But it's mainly there to help support some of the vessels. Okay. If we follow then here your auricles, again on this example of a live heart, you're going to be able to see this pulmonary trunk coming out here. Here's the ascending aorta. Right, and on our hearts when we do our dissections, they don't have the pericardium anymore because they've been taken out of the sheep. So you won't be able to see the pericardium, but you will be able to identify all of these external structures. Okay, so before we dive into the inside of the heart and how we actually put together the structure and we look at blood flow through the heart, let's talk about cardiac muscle tissue in itself. So as your heart is made of muscle, it does contain that type of tissue, muscle tissue. However, the muscle tissue in the heart is a little bit different than when we looked at muscle tissue that was in your skeletal muscle. Right? Your cardiac muscle is unique because it contains these things called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs, if you look at this projection of a slide that looks at muscle tissue, when you look at a slide, you'll actually see these different connections here that are between the different fibers in the cell. These intercalated discs, their main job is to help speed up the reaction time for the signal to go through your heart, so that when it gets that signal, that your whole heart is essentially contracting all at once instead of a wave. So remember we talked about how myelin can help that speed and jump that reaction along. The same thing is happening with the intercalated disc. It's allowing for more of the signal to be carried through. All right, so if you look at this cross section here of this cardiac tissue, so let me zoom in here. You can see the cardiac muscle, it's wrapped up in bundles, right? Your same stuff, same way that we structured any of our other muscles, right? But it's got these intercalated discs, right? And you can see this section here that's been cross-sectioned through there. These discs just increase surface area, allow for more signal to be passed through, and allow your cardiac muscle to all contract at once. Okay? So that's what I want you to know, that cardiac muscle is unique because it has these intercalated discs. Okay, so let's look at blood flow through the heart. Right? This is kind of a complicated image, but I will try to outline a lot of, explain a lot of these different features of the heart. Okay, so we already went. So when we're talking about our movement of blood through the heart, we're coming from our systemic system, so from the outside of the heart. So all of the blood is coming from your head, lower appendages, and things loading into this area. So if you look here, we've got our first step on our curve, our superior and inferior vena cava. Right, so these very large vessels, and what they do is that those two things will come together and they will form this coronary, form this part, and you see this thing, the coronary sinus. Essentially, it's a projection of tissue, a space inside of your atria that allows for more blood to be pumped through there. And you can see the nice thing about this image is how thin the walls of our atria are. So if we look between the left and right atria, the atrial walls for the muscle are actually pretty thin. And the reason why is because the blood is only being pumped from the atria to our ventricles. So it only has to go a little bit of a distance. So by keeping the muscle weak, you're limiting mass on there, but it's also not having to require, it doesn't need that much energy and that much force to push it into the ventricle. But if you compare the wall, the width of the wall in our ventricle, right, it's much thicker, right, because it's got to pump the blood further. And if you look even at the left ventricle, it's a lot bigger than what you're seeing on the right. Your right ventricle, the next place your blood flows to is to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries away from the heart to pick up oxygen in the lungs. There's a lung over here and there's a lung over here. Right, so what's going to happen now is that once the blood gets oxygenated from the lungs, it's going to enter back in through the pulmonary veins. So remember, veins go to the heart, arteries go away from the heart. They're going to enter the left atrium, go into the left ventricle, and then back out through the aorta. Okay, so through our aortic arch to our nominate, our right subclavian, or sorry, our left common carotid, and then our left subclavian. Okay. So if we follow the blood flow, right, we'll reference that image a couple times as we discuss this. There's a couple features that we need to look at in addition to kind of internal features that we need to talk about before we get through the whole circuit of what's going on for the systemic and pulmonary. All right, so with our heart, we have these valves that are between all of the different parts of our heart. So you have valves that are present if we're going from our atria to our ventricles, and then from our ventricles out to the vessels. So what you'll see here is that between our atria and ventricles, we have these things called arterioventricular valves, or AV valves, and they have a couple other names. You have a right AV valve and a left AV valve. So right is between your right atria and right ventricle, left between your left atria and left ventricle. The other way you can describe it is that if you call them the tricuspid, that is what you're going to see on the right side, and then the bicuspid is on the left side. You might have heard of this in medical shows and things. They talk about how they have issues or backflow from their tricuspid or bicuspid valve. The reason they're called a cusp is because of the flaps of tissue, the connective tissue there to separate it. So a bicuspid is going to have is going to have two flaps, and a tricuspid actually has three flaps that come together. The other type of valve you have is the semilunar valve. Semilunar valves, these are the valves that are between the vesicles and the other systems. So either between the right ventricle and the lungs, or between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, that's where you're going to see these semilunar valves. And they're called semilunar because they look like half moons. And really the main job of a valve is to stop backflow. So if there's any function you need to know about a valve, is that it prevents backflow. And backflow is bad, right? Because it will end up lowering your blood pressure. You're not going to be able to get as much oxygenated blood to your body systems. And then long run, things start to die, systems start to fail, and bam, the organism is dead. So that's why if you have issues with your heart valves, it's necessary to get them prepared and fixed. The other thing about the valve that I want to talk about are these two structures here, the chorda tendineae and the papillary muscles. So you've got the valve, which is the flap of tissue, but those things are actually connected to the muscle wall directly. So when we actually do the dissection, you'll be able to see that. So essentially the way it works is that you have your muscle that's coming from the heart, and it's connected to this really thin yet very strong layer of connective tissue that's then connected to the valve. This thing right here is called the chorda tendineae. This chorda tendineae, the other term you might hear is heartstring, because that's what it literally means. It means the heartstrings. So when you hear someone say pulling on my heartstrings, that's the structure they're actually referring to. The chorda tendineae, again, is very strong, very durable. If you try to cut it, it's difficult because it's got to be strong. It has to deal with a lot of pressure, it has to deal with a lot of push, so that actual structure is very, very tough. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the heart for today is about the circuits and the blood flow. Okay, so with our circuit, we've already addressed all of the features, but what I mainly want you to know in reference to blood flow is the major pathway that it attends. So we'll start with blood entering the heart, and then blood going through it to the lungs, and then from the lungs back out to the system of the body. So let's start with our circuit in the heart. So blood is going to pool from the superior and inferior vena cavas Then your blood enters your right, so it goes from right to left. So your right atria, it will go through your tricuspid, or you could call it your right AV valve, your atrioventricular valve, to the right ventricle. So once we get to our right ventricle, then the blood is going to pass through one of the semilunar valves, and from there it's going to pump itself into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so the pulmonary trunk comes out of the right ventricle. From there, it's going to go through the pulmonary artery. Remember, arteries are leaving the heart. And the other thing about the pulmonary artery is that this is low oxygen blood, right? Low oxygen blood. It doesn't have a very high amount because it hasn't reached the lungs yet. So once it reaches there, it'll hit the lungs. Once we get from the lungs, we're going to enter the lungs, get oxygen from through capillaries in the lungs, and it's going to head back towards the heart. So this is, again, our pulmonary circuit, essentially, is this step right here. So our pulmonary circuit, get our lungs, it's going to go into the pulmonary vein. And then from our pulmonary vein, that blood is going to enter our left atrium. So from our left atrium, we're going to go through our left atrium, through the bicuspid. So through the bicuspid, or you could call it the left AV valve. We'll go through this valve. We're going to then enter our left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, we're going to leave the blood's going to leave the heart through the aorta via the semilunar valve. All right, and then once it leaves there, we're going to hit our ascending aorta, and we are going to hit the systemic system. So we're not going to go over today all of the different vessels that this blood is flowing to and all the organs it's flowing to. We'll look at that when we actually dissect our cat and trace these blood vessels through a large portion of the body. Okay. So that's it for our discussion about the heart. So we talked about the structures of the heart. You should know the 4 chambers. You should know where they are pumping from and to. And then you should know that there's outside vessels, be able to identify pulmonary trunk, coronary arteries and veins on the front of the heart and the back of the heart, the coronary sulcus, the different aortic arch and those features. Remember that cardiac muscle itself is a little bit different. It's muscle, it's got sarcomeres, it does the contraction, it requires calcium like our reactions in our skeletal muscle. It just occurs much more quickly. Right? We'll talk more about that signaling here in another video. Right? Remember, our blood's flowing through. We saw it left and right, atrium ventricle, right atria, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk to our arteries, back from the lungs, left atria, left ventricle, out the aorta. Okay. All right, so study this. Again, take notes. Anything that you don't understand, bring those questions in, and I will be more than happy to help you with any of your problems. All right, so enjoy studying.